In this lesson, we'll take a look at cerebrospinal fluid. So we know from the spinal cord chapter that cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid that flows through the subarachnoid space, and we also saw it flowed in the central canal within the gray matter. In this lesson, we're going to see there's a third place known as the ventricles. Right? So generally, the cerebrospinal fluid is going to nourish and protect both the brain and the spinal cord. Right, so here's the specifics as far as the functions. It's going to provide mechanical protection. When you think about it, anything that floats in water is going to be protected because water is going to act as a shock absorber. Secondly, it provides an optimal environment for action potentials. We're going to make sure that there's enough sodium and potassium, all the ions that we looked at when we studied the action potential. And it also acts as a medium of exchange. It allows for circulation between the blood and the nervous tissue. And we'll see how the cerebrospinal fluid actually circulates in this lesson. So let's take a look at these new structures, the ventricles of the brain. In each cerebral hemisphere, right, we have two cerebral hemispheres, one on the left and one on the right. Each hemisphere contains a lateral ventricle. So here's a picture. This brain is actually looking to your left. We can see here, this up in here, all of this would be the left cerebral hemisphere. Then on the other side, this would be the right cerebral hemisphere. This large C shape right here, ventricle, this would be the left lateral ventricle. And then on the other side, this would be the right lateral ventricle. In the area of the diencephalon, we'll see that in the subsequent lessons, there's an part of the brain called the thalamus. At that level is the third ventricle. So right about here, this whole structure, it's one ventricle. It's more of a narrow slit-like ventricle. This is going to be called the third ventricle. And then before I go back to the note, let me just show you here. Down here, between the cerebellum in the back, and then this in the front here is the brain stem right here. This ventricle right in the middle is the fourth ventricle. Okay, so it goes two lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, and then down over here, the fourth ventricle. And so the fourth ventricle is located between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So if we were to analyze cerebrospinal fluid, we would see that it's actually a clear, colorless fluid. Right? If you held it up to the light, you'd be able to look right through it. It contains normal things, glucose, proteins, some lactic acid, a little bit of urea, again, waste products, some positively charged ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, even magnesium. And then some anions, which are the negatively charged ions, chloride, and HCO3 is bicarbonate. There could be some white blood cells that would be normal. A lot of white blood cells would indicate some type of an infection, maybe like meningitis. We don't want to see red blood cells at all. That would be a sign that a blood vessel maybe has ruptured as an aneurysm or somebody has a stroke. All right, so that's the normal the constituents of the cerebrospinal fluid. Again, here's a picture of the ventricles. We'll go back to that and show you how the fluid circulates. Before we do that, though, let's take a look at how cerebrospinal fluid is formed. So there is a network of capillaries that are located in the walls of the ventricles. We're going to call these capillaries the choroid plexus. Maybe you want to highlight that right there, the choroid plexus. Now, the choroid plexus are in close association with a neuroglia known as the ependymal cells. Right, I even put here just to kind of remind you that it's a type of neuroglia, and it's these two structures, the choroid plexus, the capillaries, and the ependymal cells that are going to make the cerebrospinal fluid. So here's a picture. What they're showing you here, this blue area is the area of the third ventricle. They picked one of the ventricles. In the wall of the ventricle, you can see this capillary right here. This is the choroid plexus. This is kind of a leaky capillary. What will happen is the plasma will go through the ependymal cells. So all of these cells here are the ependymal cells, and you can see they even have some cilia on here. The cilia helps to move the cerebrospinal fluid. But nonetheless, the plasma will come through the ependymal cell and then go into the ventricle where it's now the cerebrospinal fluid. Waste products, right, that are in the cerebrospinal fluid can go this way here. So the ependymal cell is acting as a kind of a gatekeeper, letting the substances into the cerebrospinal fluid and removing waste products back into the bloodstream. Okay, so that's how the cerebrospinal fluid is formed. We replace our total volume of CSF roughly every 3 to 4 hours. So it's a very dynamic process. It's constantly happening. You can even see here they even have tight junctions between the ependymal cells because we don't want anything to leak between the ependymal cells. We want the fluid to go through the ependymal cell. Okay, so let's take a look at the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. It starts here. We're going to say that the lateral ventricles begin the process. They make the cerebrospinal fluid. From here, the fluid is going to flow through this little foramen right here. If you remember, a foramen is a hole. And from the lateral ventricles, the fluid enters the third ventricle. Right? At this point, more cerebrospinal fluid is going to be produced. Now the cerebrospinal fluid is going to go through this long tube right here down to the fourth ventricle. This tube we're going to call the cerebral aqueduct. Once we're in the fourth ventricle, more cerebrospinal fluid is going to be made. And at this point, there's a couple openings known as apertures. There's a median aperture that's going to open up into the central canal, and then two lateral apertures that open up into the subarachnoid space. So it's from the fourth ventricle here that the fluid goes into the subarachnoid space, and then you can even see it here going down into the central canal. All right, so the sequence again, I do want you to know the sequence: lateral ventricles, through the interventricular foramen, into the third ventricle, down the cerebral aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, and at this point the fourth ventricle will allow the fluid to go either into the central canal by passing through the median aperture or into the subarachnoid space via the lateral apertures. Here's a view from the front where we get a chance to see the lateral ventricles in the hemispheres. And this is the third ventricle here. We can catch a little bit of the cerebral aqueduct, and then right in front of the brainstem, this would be the fourth ventricle. Now, let's take a look at the cerebrospinal fluid once it's in the subarachnoid space. I'm going to leave the note for a minute, and we're going to go to a picture. So again, this brain is looking to the left. This is the front right over here. Let's take it to right here. At this point, this is where the cerebrospinal fluid is in the fourth ventricle, and it's going to leave and go into the subarachnoid space. So on this diagram, this kind of green area here, all of this space would be the subarachnoid space. And you can see the cerebrospinal fluid flows down the front of the spinal cord, goes up the back of the spinal cord like this. So it's constantly circulating around the spinal cord, and then the fluid will make its way all the way up over here. The subarachnoid space is going now to the top of the brain this way, and we can see it up over here. So the cerebrospinal fluid is going to ultimately make its way over here. Some cerebrospinal fluid, if you follow these little red arrows, also go around the front of the brain. Right, so it's circulating up the brain from the front and the back. And ultimately, we're going to see everything's going to come up over here. So we said before that the cerebrospinal fluid is made every 3 to 4 hours. We make a new batch. So as we make cerebrospinal fluid at the same time, we need to reabsorb it. Otherwise, pressure will build up in the brain. So let me take you to this point. If you look right over here, there's a little extension that comes up from the subarachnoid space into this large vein up over here, this big blue structure. This is a vein called a sinus. It's actually called the superior sagittal sinus. And what happens is the cerebrospinal fluid goes into this little extension going up. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then the fluid ends up in the venous system again. It's going to become blood again. So let's take a look here. Let me just make sure we got everything. So the cerebrospinal fluid, just to go back to the note, circulates in the subarachnoid space. Like I said before, it goes down the front of the spinal cord and then comes up the spinal cord posteriorly. And then everything is going to proceed up to the top of the brain, right? Where the CSF is going to pool at the top of the brain. So again, just one more time. Down the front here, comes around the back up here, and then all the CSF is going to make its way, if you follow my cursor, all the way up to here, right? And then again, some CSF went up the front this way. But ultimately, everything is going to go over here. So let's take a look now how it gets back into the bloodstream, the cerebrospinal fluid. Here's a blow up of the subarachnoid space. So here's the subarachnoid space. So the cerebrospinal fluid would be pooling right over here. This extension going up right here is called the arachnoid villi. That's what I put in your notes. This picture, they're calling it the arachnoid granulation. It's the same thing. And the cerebrospinal fluid will go up this way into the arachnoid villi, and then it moves into the bloodstream again. This big blood vessel here is known as the superior sagittal sinus. There's other sinuses also that are draining venous blood and cerebrospinal fluid, and they ultimately drain down these veins, and then they go back into these big veins in our chest and become normal blood again. Okay, so the cerebrospinal fluid is in the subarachnoid space. It goes up the arachnoid villi and then into this big blood vessel known as the superior sagittal sinus. And again, as quickly as we're making the CSF is now going into the sinus to prevent pressure from being built up. And again, just to show you one more time, this is where the villi would be, right up over here. And that's our cerebrospinal fluid.